Hello. So I've been using Linux Mint as a main operating system since about mid-2023, and still sadly having to use Windows for some things like games. I've always thought that it's very cringe to attach your identity to a product, and I still do, even if that product is a free one without a profit motive behind it, like a Linux distribution. So I only use a Linux distribution because it's the best fit for what I need right now, but I do want to talk a bit about how my worldview has influenced me to make the jump to using free software, and how using free software has in turn influenced my worldview. Maybe it's just me becoming the unbearable Linux snob that I never wanted to be, but I do think there's a lot of depth there. So in order to make some of my upcoming points clearer, I want to rehearse some of the main points from Martin Heidegger's 1949 essay, The Question Concerning Technology. In this very difficult but very prescient essay, Heidegger challenges the typical assumption that technology is at its core a means to an end. The idea goes that a radar station is a much more complicated mechanism than a weather vane, but that at the end of the day, in their essence, they're basically the same. They're merely tools that are wielded to help us accomplish certain goals, in this sense, predicting the weather. This was, of course, my position with regard to something like Windows versus Mac OS versus Linux. Why would I attach such importance to the tools I use and not to what I do with them? In spirit, this attitude is correct. Nothing is sillier than thinking you're better than someone for using a different Linux distro or text editor or some retarded shit like that. But it is a mistake to assume that technology is nothing but a means to an end. Heidegger says that we pass by the real essence of technology in assuming this, and in doing so we court a great danger. To skip over some of the difficult sections of the essay, he ultimately concludes that technology is at its core a kind of revealing. This sounds difficult to understand until we sketch out some examples. For Heidegger, under ancient technology like a weather vane or a water wheel, nature emerges in a poetic revealing. A weather vane frees nature to reveal itself as it wills. Under modern technology like a radar station, nature is forced and constrained and exploited. And we're not just talking about overuse of resources here. We're talking about the very way that things appear to us and emerge in our experience with these pieces of technology. All the mysterious depth of nature becomes ordered and limited into what Heidegger calls a calculable coherence of forces. Modern technology does not act as the handmaid of nature to aid it and bring it forth. It turns all of nature into what Heidegger calls standing reserve. It is not that humans had never seen things as standing reserve until the modern era. Humans have been using the resources of the natural world for as long as humans have existed. The problem is that all other modes of revealing are being suppressed. And Heidegger calls this process of suppression enframing. In so doing, in all this enframing, we lose access to something important. We lose access to what it means to exist as more than a mere resource. The whole world appears, as Heidegger said, as a giant petrol station. So why do I bring this up? Because today enframing is worse than Heidegger could have ever imagined. Heidegger's writings are clearly critical of modern consumerist culture, but we'll underestimate what he means by this if we merely think he's being critical of an economic system. His criticisms of consumerism go down to our very ontology. In a world where the ability to consume resources has become so clear and streamlined, consumption increasingly becomes the dominant frame through which all objects and concepts present themselves to us. In short, this results in a mindless state of consumerism, where everything gets swapped out and replaced constantly, every object becomes obsolete more quickly than the last, and no one ever has the state of mind to sit down and really start to understand what the things we buy are as things. Of course, this has effects on the technology we make, and it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Which brings us to badly designed operating systems. Modern Windows is unbearable. It's ugly as sin, and changing anything about the GUI is about as non-intuitive as possible, and requires 5,000 plugins, which will make your system chug along even slower than before, and its baseline is already extremely power-hungry. It's full of such an unbelievable amount of bullshit, and it's very unfriendly to any attempts to remove any of it. And judging by my experience with Windows 11, it's only moving more in the direction of spying on you and fucking you in the ass with advertisements. And some poor saps are happy to give away all their privacy and install the priciest, most energy-intensive hardware possible just so that they can have their minds scanned by AI so that they can more effectively consume slop online, with the OS only crashing every hour instead of every 15 minutes. So Windows is terrible. I still use it because unfortunately I need to for a lot of games that I haven't figured out how to effectively run on Linux yet. Toho Bunkacho, shoot the bullet above all else. But I believe and hope that someday I will have all the games I need working on Linux instead. Now, Heidegger never said that we should avoid using all modern technology. He was old-fashioned, but he was not a Luddite. What he said was to use technology without losing sight of its essence, and I have pondered quite a lot about how we can use technology without the negative effects he seemed worried about, of removing everything human and natural in our relation to our very being. But I must say that I have seen examples, and I think that one way that helps us is to know more about the technology we do have. And that is what using a Linux distribution forces you to do, at least a little. I'm very much at the beginning stages of this, but ideally you start to understand the ins and outs of the operating system and how an operating system actually works. Besides just giving you a lot more freedom over how you want your operating system to look, to feel, and, well, to operate, it puts you in a different state of mind toward the operating system as well. To give a bit of an analogy of what it's like, think of the relationship you'd have between a chair that was made in an assembly line that you bought at Target, and compare it with the relationship you'd have with a chair you carved and constructed yourself from wood that you chopped down from a tree in the forest. Certainly you would have a much greater respect for the materiality of the latter. We'd not think of it without remembering that it is a thing connected to the internet-connected nexus of the natural world. It would be a thing we exist with together as compatriots in our voyage through time. We are not its sole creator or consumer, but exist with it in the vast interconnection of nature. Now, I'm a Linux noob, and I don't think I'm the guy who chops down a tree and builds a chair out of it in this metaphor. That would probably be the masochist who builds Linux from scratch, or at the very least uses a distro like Gentoo instead of Mint. No, perhaps in my case it's more accurate to say that I'm the guy who bought the homemade chair in an antique store. But even then, this is certainly an improvement over the former of the assembly line chair. I mentioned this relation to objects because I think a lot about why we, in the Western world, have such a hatred and aversion to objects in our spiritual traditions. I still believe that once Moses came down the mountain and destroyed the idol of the golden calf, Western people stopped listening to the voices of the natural world and its objects around them. And that saddens me. And I think it sustains unhealthy consumerist practices. If you think that objects don't have worth or dignity of their own, what stops you from constantly consuming them and throwing them out? Compare this with Japan, a society with a traditional belief that all objects in nature have spirits inside of them. I think that for this reason, Japan has weathered the storm of enframing comparatively well. At least until recently. In this way, their robots and their anime figures could really just become an outgrowth of their Buddha statues and sacred omamori charms and other things with spirits and souls of their own. I often think about Zune, the creator of the Toho Project series, who humorously referred to his computer as his shikigami, which in Japanese folklore refers to a kind of conjured supernatural creature that a yin-yang master can manipulate in order to make use of its magical powers. A fitting analogy for a computer. However, I discussed material objects there. An operating system is a little different. This is where I'd like to propose a challenge for the Jadevine think tank. What does animism mean in a world where objects are increasingly digital? A robot could have a spirit, to a Japanese Shintoist, as it too is a material object among others, and all material objects in nature have spirits. A robot, too, is born out of the same nexus of the rare minerals that moved from the hands of a child miner in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to a chip factory in Taiwan to a retailer in Akihabara. But what do we make of digital objects with no real materiality at all? Do the rules still apply? Certainly animist faiths like Shinto are by nature suited to the idea of non-material objects, as spirits and souls are the original non-material objects. But what does reverence for a digital object look like? Is there the same danger of enframing here? I do not know the answer. All I can say is that having your hands more deep in the code of your own operating system, as Linux enables you to do bit by bit, seems like a step in the right direction to me. I think it gives you a relationship much more like the craftsman who makes a chair than the consumer who buys a mass-produced one at a store. As long as you actually end up, using it as a chair and not just posting gay pictures of it to r/Unix porn all day. With all this in mind now, I thought I'd do something a little different in this talk and share some details about my setup for all the computer nerds out there. I feel like I've finally been able to get a desktop environment that comes close to reflecting my exact ideal of what things should be like, and I'm pretty excited about that. I highly recommend all the following programs, but again, use what works for you. Don't fall into the cult of consumerism. You can fall into the cult of consumerism even if it's free software. Never forget that. So I have two computers that I use for all my activities. I have a desktop PC that I built and that I mostly use to play games these days. It dual boots Windows 10 and Linux Mint. I first permititioned my drive and installed Mint back around the summer of 2023. I was inspired to do that because I knew that Windows 10 is reaching its end of support, and I really hate Windows 11 and don't want to use it, so I thought it was time to get used to GNU Linux so I didn't have to deal with being at the beck and call of Microsoft anymore. Unfortunately, the biggest problem is some games still not working very well. Most of the games I have could probably get working with the right finagling, but I play too many small dojin games that aren't on platforms like Steam or GOG, and some of them just have the weirdest bugs. In any case, I haven't given up, but for now it's keeping me tied to Windows, at least for the sake of playing a decent number of games. However, I'm more and more in the process of shifting my desktop computer to be more like a gaming console, as I do most of my work for research, writing video scripts and HTML, answering emails, and everything else you use a computer for pretty much on a refurbished Lenovo ThinkPad T480. I run Linux Mint on here as well, and this is where I really experiment more. Here's my basic NeoFetch info. Now let me make it clear, I don't have a formal background in computer science or anything like that. I'm not a programmer. I'm by no means an expert at this kind of stuff, so I'm not the person you should be asking to help you with problems or about what distro is the best or all that. I got Linux Mint simply because it was similar to Windows and thus encouraged as an easy transition. Of course, now I use i3 as a window manager. It's a tiled manager, which means that I don't have free-floating windows, but rather that all programs open full screen by default. Then the screen keeps getting split when I add more. I can adjust the position and size of these, but the basic idea is that there's no wasted screen real estate. I love it. I naturally tend to want to keep a lot of stuff in front of me at once while working, and tiling windows basically let me do automatically what I've been trying to do by clicking and dragging windows around for years. Granted, sometimes it fuels my bad habits of multitasking to the degree that I never get anything done, but at its best, it helps me out a lot. I don't have some really pimped out desktop like you see on r/Unix porn or whatever, and I find those kind of to defeat the purpose of using a more simple, stripped down operating system in the first place, but because I'm here to work on, essays and web pages and videos, and not to cosplay as Lane. But I don't think it's wrong to make an environment that you like. And this is where mine might be a little silly, but I have a rotating set of 26 desktops, all from the Arcana Heart 3 website, and showcasing characters from the game. Of course, when you have a tiled window manager, you almost never see your desktop. So what's the solution? Transparent windows. Mine are pretty mild, though. I see some of those Unix porn setups, and I think it looks impossible to read anything in, but most of my sites and programs are high-contrast white text on black backgrounds, so I set active windows to an opacity of 90% and inactive ones to an opacity of 80%. It allows me to adequately maximize the amount of time I spent staring at cute anime girls, and it motivates and inspires me. You know how some writers are more inspired when they look out a window with a pretty landscape? Same difference. I'm not such an elite hacker that I do absolutely everything from the command line, but I do have 3 programs that all operate on the command line that I love. One is called NNN, and it's my primary file browser. Another is called Calcurse, and it's basically a calendar and to-do list application. And the last is called Newsboat, which I use for managing RSS feeds. I try to read as many blogs and news articles and so on as I can in the command line, just because it's nice to get the text with as little in the way as possible. And it keeps track of all the sites I care about and automatically tells me which ones are updated. It's basically like a feed for any site, like Twitter or whatever, but you have a lot more control of it. I've just gotten into using RSS feeds like this, but I really dig them. The text editor that I use to write scripts for these videos, to take notes, to write HTML, and to do just about anything else is called Genie. Though I like to pretend to be a command line hacker and all that, I'm not at the level where I use some quote-unquote elite text editor like Vim or Emacs or something, but I switched to Genie from Notepad++ when I migrated from Windows, and I primarily liked it because by default, it has a sort of tree of files on the left, allowing you to have quick access to the files you want to look at and visualize where they're stored. However, nowadays terminal window within an N replaces this for me, so I just keep it hidden. The only possible reason I may switch from Genie is that it doesn't support Emmet, which seems like a really helpful addition for writing HTML, but I don't plan on it in the meantime at least. I read a lot of documents while taking notes on philosophy and whatnot, and the reader I like most is called Zathura. It was really what got me into these suckless or minimal programs and sent me down this whole rabbit hole. It basically has no GUI and is entirely keyboard operated, which is wonderfully simple and direct. One thing that I adore is that you can invert the color of any PDF by just pressing Ctrl-R. I always do this because black text on a white background is because white text on a black background is far easier on my eyes during long hours of study. Zathura is blazing fast and super useful. I also have LibreOffice in case I ever need to do fancy Word documents or whatever, but I only do that on rare occasions, usually for work or stuff. I use LibreWolf as a web browser. I've debated using Pale Moon or IceCat, but that would mostly just be for some shallow cosmetic reasons. The thing is that I had Firefox's config tweaked to shit, so LibreWolf didn't even really change that much for me, besides of course allowing me to no longer directly support Mozilla, which is certainly a big deal. My reason for switching was pretty shallow. I was sick of the awful new Firefox simplified Corposlop logo, and I tried to replace the icon even on my computer with the old one, but could never get it to stick. So LibreWolf's logo is kind of corpofied itself, but at least it doesn't remind me of better times gone by. To make the web slightly usable, I use a lot of add-ons. uBlock Origin comes pre-installed with LibreWolf, but I also use SponsorBlock, which is probably the best add-on ever made. Return YouTube dislike. I still don't care about cookies, which gets rid of useless cookie warnings that pop up on sites. Reader view, which allows me to use news sites without ads and bloat eating half the page. Awesome RSS, which lets me quickly find RSS feeds. Local CDN, which blocks connections to data centers at places like Google and Cloudflare. And Clear Your URLs, which removes tracking elements from URLs. For search engines, my default one is Ecosia. I don't know how to say it, but its claim to fame is apparently using the revenue it gains to plant trees. As an ecologist, I appreciate that kind of thing, although I'm aware that it isn't a silver bullet to saving the earth. If anything, it's more of a bonus to what's a pretty good search engine on its own. Sometimes the results seem somewhat curated like Google's, though obviously nowhere near as bad. It has a good image search feature. I try to use several search engines, though, to make sure I'm getting a broad sweep of stuff, with DuckDuckGo and Mojeek, two others that I use most after Ecosia. I also use two excellent specialist search engines called Wibby and Marginalia, which are designed to only show small, personal Web 1.0 style websites and filter out sites owned by big corporate interests, which is amazing and very useful. However, the downside for that is that their results are often kind of spotty and inconsistent, but still, they're a great way to find new websites and define quality over quantity. As for some other things, to get through them quickly, I use Mullvad as a VPN and FileZilla as a file transfer protocol. I use a tiny program called SXIV to view images, and another called Fe for my wallpaper rotation script. I need to update SXIV to its fork in SXIV, but I can't get it to work for whatever reason. I use a music player called Quadlibet. I miss Foobar 2000 from Windows a lot, but Quadlibet is almost as good. The one thing I can't really do with it is get music on my smartphone, but these days I mostly listen to podcasts and audiobooks and stuff on my phone when driving instead of music. So I can use my Windows install if I really need to put music from Foobar on my phone. But yeah, Quadlibet's good. I still use VLC Media Player to play videos. I use YTDLP to download YouTube videos, but I still haven't gotten it totally set up. I'm trying to move to the FreeTube client in general so I can keep watching YouTube without feeding the monster called Google, but I've had technical difficulties. I use Ksnip to take screenshots, Krita and GIMP to edit pictures, Audacity to record audio, Shotcut to edit videos, Calibre to manage ebooks, Sci+ Element, and unfortunately still Discord for instant messaging, and I record and live stream things off my computer with OBS Studio. Anyway, no one probably cares about any of that, but If for some reason you're a computer nerd who is curious what kind of software I'm running, that's it. And they're all highly recommended if you're looking for good alternatives to proprietary software. All right. Well, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.